The entire class laughed, because the teacher told them to. Zion wasn't failing math. He was set up to fail in front of everyone. The equation on the board wasn't just unsolvable. It was planted rigged to humiliate the only black kid in the room. But as he stepped forward and picked up the chalk, he smiled. What he did next made the entire school go silent. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The hallways of Hawthorne Middle School were decked in red and green paper streamers that drooped like tired garlands as the end of the semester crept closer, and the air carried the familiar scent of pine from skinny artificial trees propped in corners, mingling with the nervous excitement of students whispering about holiday plans and final grades. But in room 208, a different kind of tension hovered just beneath the tinsel and fake cheer, a tension that began the moment Evelyn Linden stood at the front of her gifted class with a clipboard in one hand and a calculated smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Linden had taught advanced mathematics at Hawthorne for nearly a decade, and she had cultivated a reputation for brilliance, but also for biting sarcasm and a competitive streak that made students who struggled with numbers dread her challenges. On that crisp December morning, with sunlight slicing through the blinds and casting long shadows across the whiteboard, she announced what she called the Winter Puzzle Challenge, something she claimed would be a fun celebration of logic before break. Most of the students nodded politely, shuffling in their seats, but 13-year-old Zion Hart, the only black student in the class, felt a familiar pang in his chest that had nothing to do with math anxiety and everything to do with the way Linden's gaze slid over him with a curious blend of scrutiny and expectation. He had earned his place in the gifted classroom fairly. His grades were impeccable, his reasoning sharp, and his teachers in elementary school had praised his analytical mind without reservation. But in this room, under this teacher's watchful eyes, he often felt as though he carried a target on his back. Ms. Linden's voice carried a sweetness that morning that tasted too sugary on the tongue, as though she were masking something sharper. "This puzzle," she said, motioning to the sprawling equation she had already sketched in thick black marker across the board, "isn't just about arriving at the right answer. It's about the journey, the perseverance it takes to think beyond what's expected." A few students leaned forward, intrigued, but several exchanged uneasy glances as they took in the complexity of the symbols and scribbles that seemed to twist into themselves like a labyrinth with no clear exit. Linden's eyes then found Zion's just long enough for him to feel a prickle of awareness crawl up his spine. "Zion," she said, her voice lilting with an edge that only he seemed to feel, "why don't you start us off?" The class quieted instantly. Zion's heartbeat thudded like a drum in his ears. "I'll try," he said, though his voice didn't betray fear. It carried a calm that had become second nature to him after years of being watched and judged through the prism of others' biases. He stepped up to the board, chalk in hand, and scanned the tangled puzzle with eyes trained to detect patterns others missed. The room held its breath, as if the walls themselves waited for what would happen next. A few students shifted in their seats. Some looked curious, others apprehensive, but no one spoke. Miss Linden lingered at the edge of the group, arms crossed, smile fixed but eyes cool and appraising as though she were watching a performance she had carefully scripted. Zion's mind, however, saw something the others didn't. The way a segment of the equation looped back on itself. A peculiar symmetry that suggested the puzzle wasn't purely chaotic but had been constructed with intention. His heart didn't thump with panic, it thumped with recognition, the same rhythmic certainty he felt whenever he solved the chess problems. His uncle had left him before moving to Chicago to take care of Zion's grandmother. The class whispered behind him, not loudly but in a low hum of disbelief as he began tracing lines, erasing a segment here, redrawing a connection there, his fingers moving with a fluid certainty that seemed at odds with the complexity before him. "Every equation has its rhythm," he murmured, not loud enough for everyone to hear but clear enough that Miss Linden's head tilted slightly, as though she were puzzled by his confidence rather than his skill. In the third grade, Zion had been labeled a prodigy by a teacher who saw beyond his skin. In the 7th grade, he was labeled a troublemaker by a mall security guard who assumed he was up to no good as he waited for his ride home after a tutoring session. The memories flickered in his mind, not like scars but like reminders. He had survived each whisper of dismissal, each sideways glance that spoke louder than words. Today, he told himself, this puzzle was just another test, only this time, the stakes were humiliation in front of peers rather than the silent erasure of potential. Just a puzzle, he repeated in his mind, though he knew it was more than that for Ms. Linden, and more than that for himself. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow as the chalk traced a path towards something resembling clarity. The room seemed to shrink around him, and the festive decorations on the walls blurred in his peripheral vision. A student named Carter, who usually boasted loudly about his own math grades, leaned forward with a tentative smile, whispering, "Dude, that actually makes sense." Then there was Mira, sharp-eyed and focused, her phone perched discreetly in her lap, recording every movement. Zion didn't question it. She had always believed in him, even when others hadn't. Still, with every line he drew, the silence in the room grew heavier, more pregnant with expectation and something else, something like disbelief. Ms. Linden stepped closer, her posture poised, as though ready to interject, but she didn't. Her lips were a thin line, and though she maintained her professional composure, something in her eyes flickered, perhaps surprise, or something closer to fear, that her carefully controlled narrative was slipping from her grasp. The chalkboard, once an indecipherable mess, began to reveal patterns of logic, elegant in their symmetry, as Zion worked methodically, unraveling what no one in that class had ever unlocked before. Students who had once looked at the puzzle with confusion now watched him with a mix of admiration and disbelief. Some leaned in, murmuring to one another. Others simply stared, caught in a moment that seemed to stretch and warp time itself. And yet, just as he was nearing the final connection, the room's festive cheer seemed to hold its breath, as though the lights dimmed slightly, and the paper snowflakes taped to the windows shook ever so faintly, as if anticipating the outcome of what was unfolding. Zion's chalk hovered over the last equation, and a sense of déjà vu washed over him, like the moment in a dream when you realize you've been here before. In this place of trembling anticipation and electric possibility, a bead of chalk dust fell onto the floor, scattering like a constellation of tiny white stars against the gray linoleum. Ms. Linden cleared her throat, a barely perceptible sound, but enough to make Zion's head flick in her direction. There was a tension in her stance that wasn't there before, a tension born of uncertainty, perhaps even fear, that the boy she'd planned to expose as inadequate was instead on the brink of extraordinary revelation. The class was silent now. Even the distant hum of the heating vents seemed to fade, as though the entire room waited with bated breath. Carter leaned forward again, eyes wide, while Mira continued to record, her expression unreadable but unwavering in its intensity. Zion exhaled slowly, feeling the rhythm of the puzzle align with the rhythm in his chest. He connected the final lines, completing the impossible pattern with a flourish that was both quiet and profound, causing an almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere, like the moment before a storm breaks. The chalkboard seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights, the equation now whole, harmonious, solved, not just with logic but with an unseen resonance that made silence feel heavy, powerful, and irreversible. The class stayed motionless, the weight of that truth hanging in the air, until finally, Zion turned away from the chalkboard and faced the room. There was a strange stillness in his gaze, not triumphant, but resolute, as though he had walked through a portal and returned with something that belonged to him all along. A few students exhaled audibly, disbelief morphing into genuine awe. Miss Linden's face was an enigma, part shock, part something darker, like the silence that follows when someone's entire belief system unravels, unexpectedly. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, Zion lowered his chalk and placed a steady hand against the board, feeling the cool surface beneath his palm, as though anchoring himself to reality. After a moment of quiet transcendence, the festive decorations seemed to sway slightly, as if acknowledging the shift that had taken place within the room, an unspoken acknowledgement that something had changed, something that could not be returned to what it was before. And in that suspended beat of time, as the fluorescent lights hummed overhead and the shadows stretched across the walls, Zion Hart stood at the center of attention, not as a spectacle, not as a prop in someone else's narrative, but as a boy who had just done something no one else in that class had ever imagined possible. Then, as if summoned by the sudden charge in the room, Zion's lips curved into a small knowing smile, an expression that held both calm certainty and quiet defiance, one that suggested he understood what had happened and what was yet to come. And with that, his gaze drifted from the chalkboard to the silent faces around him, every pair of eyes wide with a mixture of shock, admiration, and disbelief, leaving the class suspended in a moment that would change everything, until the next second, when he spoke 4 simple words that would send an unexpected ripple through the room and beyond, setting the stage for conflicts no one yet understood, and revelations no one saw coming. The room was still spinning from Zion's quiet defiance, his poised walk back from the board, his hand brushing the chalk tray as though leaving behind a signature on a mural no one believed he could finish. The impossible puzzle, once a weapon meant to expose his supposed limitations, now sat fully solved in front of 30 witnesses who hadn't blinked in over a minute. It wasn't the math that stunned them. It was how he made it look easy. But it was Zion's next move that shattered the stillness. With eyes locked onto Ms. Linden, he let his voice rise just enough for everyone to hear, yet low enough that it stung like a whispered insult. Was this supposed to be a joke? The air thickened like a storm cloud folding in on itself. You could hear the faint creak of a student shifting in their seat, the soft buzz of the overhead lights, the silence before everything split open. Ms. Linden's fake smile froze mid-expression. Her lips twitched, and for the first time that semester, she didn't have a rehearsed response. Her fingers curled tighter around her clipboard. The control she prided herself on was slipping, and Zion knew it. The entire class knew it, and it terrified her. "I beg your pardon?" she asked, her voice icy, though laced with something far shakier than before. Zion didn't step back. He stood planted like a boy who'd stopped shrinking to fit inside the spaces given to him. He wasn't disrespectful. His tone remained calm, but it had the precision of someone who understood exactly what this moment was. Ms. Linden tried to regain her footing, letting out a condescending chuckle as she stepped forward, placing herself between Zion and the board like a shield. "Well, this was just for fun," she said, performing for the class now. "But if you're feeling confident," she let the sentence hang, her tone curling around the word confident, like it was some sort of accusation. Her eyes flicked around the room, inviting laughter that didn't come. Only Carter offered a nervous chuckle, quickly stifled when no one joined in. Zion tilted his head. "What if I solve it?" 4 words, softly spoken, but sharper than any insult he could have thrown back. It wasn't just a question, it was a challenge, one that flipped every bit of power Miss Linden thought she held. And for the first time, she looked scared. Not of him, but of what it would mean if he could solve the puzzle she had deliberately crafted to be unsolvable. Something in her posture shifted, her back stiffened, her smile vanished entirely, and her knuckles paled against the clipboard. She opened her mouth to respond but hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty passing behind her eyes as the class leaned in, fully invested now. The tension in the room wasn't just about race or math anymore. It was about control and the fact that Zion had just taken it. "I don't recall saying it was a competition," she said eventually, her voice returning to its familiar false warmth. "You already tried your best. Let's move on." But Zion didn't move, and that smile, that small knowing curve of his lips returned like a light flickering back on. He turned to face the board again, studying the now familiar web of symbols, lines, and loops he'd decoded just minutes ago. "You said no one's ever solved this," he said, his voice even. "So what happens if I do?" The question sliced through the air, clean and unforgiving. The class didn't move, but a shift had occurred, invisible but real. A couple students began to root for him silently. Mira, still holding her phone just low enough to avoid detection, had stopped recording, not out of disinterest but because she knew now this wasn't the climax. It was only the beginning. Ms. Linden let out a breath that sounded too forced. "It's irrelevant now. We're moving on to the review packet." She stepped closer to the smartboard, almost instinctively reaching for the eraser. But Zion, without raising his voice or lifting his hand, said one word that made her freeze in place. "Why?" That question, so simple, so quiet, was the loudest thing anyone had said all class. It wasn't rebellious, it was logical, and that made it dangerous. Why is it irrelevant now, if it wasn't 5 minutes ago? A few students exchanged glances. Some nodded. Others, like Carter, looked visibly confused, unsure where to stand. The hierarchy they had trusted all semester was cracking, and no one wanted to be on the wrong side of it. Mrs. Linden tried to pivot, eyes narrowing. "Zion, let's not make this dramatic. If you think you solved it, fine. But I'm not spending the last day before break humoring." She stopped, mid-sentence, because Zion had already begun rewriting the solution. Not with the same chalk, with a new piece, one he retrieved from the ledge, like it belonged to him. He didn't ask, he didn't wait, he just started. This time, every stroke of chalk was slower, more deliberate, but somehow more elegant. The symbols didn't dance, they sang, and with each equation he rebuilt, each line he clarified, the lie Ms. Linden had tried to orchestrate fell apart, piece by piece. The class, once passive observers, had become silent witnesses to a quiet kind of rebellion, the kind that didn't need shouting or fists, just truth and math, and a 13-year-old boy who refused to shrink. And then the twist came, subtle but explosive. Zion reached the end of the puzzle, and stopped, not because he was done, but because he'd noticed something. Why are there two different functions layered over each other? He asked aloud, not turning around. The room stilled again. One's in red ink, the other's faint, almost invisible, like it was written, then erased halfway. The board under the fluorescent lights revealed something no one had caught before. There was a second equation underneath the main one, faint, smudged, but real. Ms. Linden's face lost all color. That's irrelevant, she said quickly. That was just part of a draft. But Zion turned then, slowly, calmly, and said something that hit harder than any accusation. So the puzzle was designed never to be solved. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The words were heavy enough on their own. Linden's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her power was unraveling before 30 pairs of eyes. The room was no longer a classroom. It was a courtroom, and Zion wasn't on trial anymore. Did you make it unsolvable on purpose? The question wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. Everyone heard it. Everyone felt it. The students looked at each other, some frowning, some whispering. Linden's silence said more than any denial could. It was just a learning exercise, she finally muttered. But her voice had no force, no control. Zion didn't respond. He just set the chalk down gently and returned to his seat, never breaking eye contact. Mira restarted her recording, and just before Zion sat down, he paused, looked around the room, and said the one sentence that flipped the entire narrative on its head. This was never about the puzzle. It was about proving someone didn't belong. The bell hadn't rung, but the class was already over. Every unspoken tension, every lingering whisper, every cold glance or offhand comment suddenly had context, and none of it could be unseen now. Just as Zion sat down, Mira's phone buzzed. Airdrop request. No name. Just one file. Truth behind the puzzle. Weave. She accepted, confused. Opened it. Watched. Her eyes widened. Zion, she whispered. You need to see this. He leaned over, confused. The video opened with a familiar voice. Ms. Linden, recorded last week in an empty classroom. I bet he tries to solve it. And when he fails, we'll finally see he's not that special after all. A student had been recording. A student no one suspected. Zion stared at the screen, the color draining from his face, not from fear, but from the shock of betrayal and confirmation. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was fact, and now it was digital. Mira looked up at him, panicked. What do we do now? Zion didn't answer, because someone else had already started sharing the video. As Zion stood frozen in front of the chalkboard, that strange half-erased line scribbled faintly in the corner of the board snatched his full attention. It was barely visible, camouflaged in the smudged residue of earlier lessons. But to Zion's trained eyes, it wasn't just a random doodle. It looked intentional, deliberate, like someone had tried to erase it in a hurry, but not well enough. He leaned in slightly, pretending to adjust the chalk in his hand, while reading the faint handwriting that looked rushed, almost frantic. Don't let her play you. The sentence was messy, written in a different handwriting than Ms. Linden's tight, meticulous scrawl. Zion's stomach twisted, not in fear but in something deeper. Recognition. It wasn't paranoia now. This had been a setup from the beginning, and someone had known. Someone before him had sat in this same spot, felt the same quiet targeting, and tried to warn whoever came next. His hands tightened around the chalk. His chest rose slowly as he inhaled, the voices of that room receding just for a moment, as memories broke through. Memories that explained why he hadn't cracked, even as Ms. Linden's smirk turned to ice. Zion wasn't new to this feeling. It started years before this classroom. He was 9 the first time he got stopped at the mall. Security had approached him while he stood outside the candy store waiting for his mom to finish shoe shopping. The guard didn't ask for a receipt, didn't ask for his name, just asked him what he had stuffed in his coat. Zion remembered blinking in confusion before opening his coat, revealing nothing but his Spider-Man hoodie and a juice-stained homework folder. No apology followed, just a muttered "be careful who you stare at," like his very presence had been the threat. He never forgot how his mom's face went blank with fury when he told her later, her hand shaking as she zipped up his jacket for him tighter than necessary. "We don't fold," she had whispered. "We figure it out. That's what they're scared of." And then there was elementary school. 5th grade, when the lunch aide started sitting kids by behavior patterns. A made-up system that just so happened to isolate the black and brown kids at a separate table under the exit sign. Zion remembered counting tiles on the floor to distract himself from the stares. He remembered the lunchroom whispers, how kids assumed it must be punishment even though no one had done anything. His friends stopped sitting with him, then stopped talking altogether. Loneliness had its own sound, sharp, metallic, like the silence before a fire alarm. It was during that year he started solving puzzles. He found an old book at a garage sale. Mind games for teens, with creased pages and notes in the margins. He devoured it. Not because he liked math, because puzzles didn't judge. They didn't ask questions before forming opinions. If you were right, you were right. It was fair. The only thing in his world that felt that way. Back in the classroom, Zion's fingers brushed the chalkboard. As he glanced over his shoulder, Miss Linden was watching him too closely now. Her arms were still crossed, but she had stepped a few inches forward from her usual spot, as if trying to silently intimidate him back into his seat. But Zion's spine had already locked into place. He wasn't just solving an equation anymore. He was standing in for every time he'd been followed around a store, pulled aside by substitute teachers who forgot he was in the honors group, or asked if he was lost in the gifted classroom during his first week. Each of those moments etched a layer of armor. Each became another reason to never flinch when someone tried to shrink him. He touched the edge of the faint message again. Don't let her play you, and realized something more dangerous. This setup was a pattern. He wasn't the first target. That note didn't just scream warning. It hinted at history. Maybe there had been others. Quiet ones. Ones who hadn't had the proof. The ones who folded before they figured it out. Zion couldn't let that happen again. Not for them. Not for him. Not for what his mother had survived to raise him this strong. He could still hear her voice. Firm, unwavering, on the night he broke down in 6th grade. After being told he didn't test like a gifted kid. She had looked him dead in the eyes and said, "They'll doubt you before you even speak. So let your silence shake them." Now, Zion's silence was loud. Deafening even. The class felt it. Some students still sat stiffly, unsure whether to side with the teacher or the boy who had just exposed something far more complex than a math puzzle. Mira was still seated just behind him, quietly holding her phone, her eyes bouncing between him and the board. Her gaze said everything. Whatever you do next, we're watching, we're with you. It wasn't verbal. It didn't need to be. There was power in being seen like that, especially when so many systems were designed to make you invisible. But just as Zion prepared to resume working on the board, he noticed something else. A small folded paper wedged behind the chalk tray. It was creased and aged, its edges curled like it had been sitting there for weeks. His fingers closed around it, subtle enough not to draw attention. He unfolded it with careful hands, reading the barely legible print. It wasn't a worksheet. It was a note. A name was signed at the bottom. Terrence J. The message read, "She changes the puzzle every time. Make sure the wrong answer looks right." I bombed it in front of everyone. Then she told the class I didn't belong. They clapped. Zion blinked slowly, fire flickering in his chest. That name, he'd heard it once. Terrence Jameson, an older student who had transferred suddenly last year after academic struggle. Zion remembered seeing him once in the hallway. Quiet, withdrawn, always avoiding the gifted room. Everyone thought he just wasn't smart enough. But this was a playbook. Ms. Linden had done this before. His jaw tensed. He knew what he had to do. This wasn't just about showing he could solve a puzzle. This was about ending a cycle, with his heart pounding, and fingers steady. Zion placed the note quietly in his back pocket, like a piece of evidence being archived. Then he turned back to the chalkboard, chalk in hand, ready to not just solve but expose. And for the first time since entering the room that morning, he felt no fear, only clarity. He wasn't alone, and he wasn't imagining it. The game was rigged. But now he held the rulebook. He began redrawing the puzzle, not the same way as before, but building from the edges inward, demonstrating how the layers had been manipulated to mislead the solver. Each movement of chalk was slower now, more deliberate, as if he were not only solving but teaching the class to see the truth in real time. Students leaned in. The silence wasn't confusion anymore, it was reverence. Ms. Linden shifted again, subtly, but Zion caught. Her poker face was cracking with every new line he drew. And then, just as he curved the chalk to complete the first core section, the classroom door clicked open. Everyone turned. A substitute teacher stood awkwardly in the doorway, holding a stack of printouts. "Ms. Linden?" she said, confused. "You called for, extra review copies." Ms. Linden blinked, then nodded stiffly, walking over and accepting the papers with robotic hands. But her eyes darted toward Zion before quickly shifting away. Her performance was slipping. Everyone saw it. Even the sub paused for a second, her eyes catching the board mid-solution, clearly confused by what she walked into. "That the winter challenge?" she asked lightly, unaware of the tension. Zion didn't respond, but the smirk Ms. Linden offered the substitute was painfully forced. He knew now he had her cornered. But something still didn't sit right. If Terrence had tried to speak up before, and got erased, how far would she go to protect her image again? Zion's hand stopped midway through drawing the next segment. Something clicked in his mind, a realization that sent a chill down his spine. The puzzle this version was different from the one he'd seen just 3 weeks ago. On the dry erase board in the corner, the structure was completely rearranged. Miss Linden hadn't just updated the challenge, she rebuilt it entirely. She wanted this one to fail. This wasn't a test of intellect. It was a public trap crafted carefully, cruelly, with a target in mind. Zion turned toward the class slowly and asked, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Has anyone ever seen her give this same puzzle twice?" The room went silent, and then, from the back, a hand went up. The silence that followed Zion's question, "Has anyone ever seen her give this same puzzle twice?" hung in the air like a loaded pause in a courtroom. Time didn't move forward. It stretched sideways. Students froze mid-breath. The tension was no longer academic. It was racial. It was systemic. It was personal. From the back of the room, a hand rose, slowly, hesitant at first, then steady. It was Grayson, a quiet kid, who mostly kept to himself, known more for his sketches in the margins of his math homework than for raising his voice. He cleared his throat, all eyes turning to him. "Yeah," he said carefully. "She gave a different version last year. Same title. Looked the same at first, but the numbers were in a different order." Zion's chest clenched. Not out of fear, but validation. His instincts hadn't been wrong. The trap was real. His heartbeat was steady now. Focus. Grayson wasn't finished. "And one of the kids in our class solved it. Micah. But she told him he missed a step. Made him redo it in front of everyone." Grayson looked down, his voice quieter now. He got flustered. He cried. "Transferred out by January." That name, Micah. Zion didn't know him, but he suddenly felt connected to him in the most painful way possible. Another kid who probably sat where he stood now, thinking he was being tested on his mind, only to realize his dignity was what had really been on the line. Zion's gaze snapped back to the board, to the puzzle's strange loops and smudges. He stepped closer, eyes scanning like a detective returning to a crime scene he now understood was staged. The anomalies jumped out like warning signs. Parts of the puzzle had clearly been reworked. Zion saw erased grid marks along the left side, evidence that the original framing had shifted. Some numbers were slightly tilted, uneven in pressure, like they had been rewritten over faded ones. Then there were the smudged variables near the center, a swirl of black and gray that seemed almost intentionally confusing. He remembered something Terrence had written in his folded note. "She makes sure the wrong answer looks right." This puzzle wasn't broken. It was redesigned to fail. And the worst part, it was presented under the illusion of opportunity. He glanced at Ms. Linden, who was now holding the stack of review papers like a flimsy shield. Her eyes betrayed her. They were darting, defensive. For someone who normally had complete control over the room, she now looked like someone struggling to maintain her mask. Zion wasn't playing anymore. He was dismantling the game. He picked up the eraser, not to destroy, but to reveal. He slowly and carefully wiped one small section of the board, exposing a faded layer beneath. The class leaned forward. A second version of the puzzle was underneath the current one. Not completely different, but definitely altered. A correction, perhaps. A revision. Or maybe a blueprint for confusion. Mira's voice broke the silence. Why would there be a second version? Her tone wasn't accusatory. It was curious. But it struck Ms. Linden like an alarm. Because Ms. Linden started, her voice cracking slightly. Because I was adjusting the difficulty. It's common practice. Zion didn't flinch. Is it also common practice to make sure the solution is mathematically unreachable? He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. The weight of his words made the room feel colder. Ms. Linden swallowed hard, her smile fading into something harder. Defensive. You're twisting this into something it's not. But Zion shook his head. No, he said firmly. You did that when you called this a brain teaser, but made sure it couldn't be solved. The students were fully alert now, some sitting at the edge of their seats, others whispering quietly to one another. It was more than drama. It was revelation. The gifted class, always told they were being challenged to think bigger, now realized the challenge had rules they weren't told about. Rules that shifted depending on who stood at the front of the class. Zion wasn't just exposing one unfair puzzle, he was exposing a culture. And it stung. Because now they had to ask themselves, how many times had they watched this happen and said nothing? Zion continued working through the equation, now reversing it, breaking it down from the supposed solution, and retracing its steps backwards. Each line of correction painted a clearer picture. Here, he pointed, this variable loop doesn't resolve. It introduces a circular dependency with no endpoint. He circled it in red. Even if someone followed all the steps perfectly, they'd loop forever. There's no closure. He paused, then turned slowly. That's not an accident. That's sabotage. Miss Linden stepped forward suddenly, slamming her papers on her desk. Enough, she snapped, louder than necessary. The sharpness in her voice made some students jump. You're not a teacher. You don't get to hijack my class. Her words echoed, venom-laced. The mask was off, and what lay underneath wasn't simply frustration. It was fear, laced with entitlement. Zion's very existence as smart, composed and unshakably right, threatened her authority. Her plan had depended on him breaking, not building. But Zion didn't react. He looked her straight in the eye and said, "You didn't want it solved, did you?" The words were almost a whisper, but they hit like thunder. The room dropped into silence again. No one moved. Even the substitute in the corner, who had been flipping through the papers absent-mindedly, stopped cold. Mira's phone was recording again, her camera light off, silent, unflinching. And then an unexpected twist. A sound cut through the tension. A phone buzzed, loud. Then another. And another. Notifications. All across the classroom. Students began checking their screens. Zion's head tilted slightly. Mira's eyes widened. "Oh my God," she murmured. "It's online." Zion turned toward her. "What is?" She showed him her screen. Someone had already uploaded the earlier clip of Zion solving the puzzle, with the caption "Black Genius Outsmarts Racist Teacher's Impossible Puzzle." The video was only 6 minutes old, but already the views were climbing. Hundreds, then thousands. Mira whispered, "This wasn't me. I hadn't uploaded it yet." Zion's face paled, not in fear but realization. Someone else had been recording. From a different angle, possibly even earlier. The camera angle wasn't Mira's. It was higher, from the back, overhead, like from a phone propped up on a bookshelf. Zion looked around. Grayson? Carter? One of the quiet ones? Someone had seen what was coming, and planned ahead. Ms. Linden noticed the shift. Eyes darting across the sea of phones lighting up. "Put your phones away," she barked. Now, but it was too late. The classroom was no longer contained. The truth had leaked, and it was running faster than she ever expected. Mira looked at Zion again. "Who do you think posted it?" He didn't answer. His eyes were locked on Ms. Linden now, who was dialing her phone with shaking hands. Probably the main office. Probably damage control. But damage control didn't work when the fire had already started. As Zion watched her scramble, his phone buzzed too. An airdrop from a blocked sender. He opened it. One image, a screenshot of Terrence Jamison's failing grade, marked gifted removal, behavioral performance. Below it in red ink, it read, "Next one better know his place." Zion didn't ask for permission this time. He stepped to the board with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen through the illusion, and was now setting it on fire. He erased the corrupted puzzle, with long deliberate strokes, the chalk dust falling like ash. The mess Linden had weaponized as rigorous academic challenge was exposed for what it was, a riddle designed not to be solved, but to discredit him. Now he would build the problem the way it should have been. Pure, logical, fair. The room had gone silent again, but this time, it wasn't just anticipation. It was something closer to awe. Zion started fresh, his handwriting sharp and clean, marking equations in a way that didn't just show math. It told a story. He built the structure from the ground up, reconstructing the logic step by step, exposing where the original had intentionally broken symmetry and hidden loops of failure. The chalk moved steadily, and with each symbol murmurs grew behind him. Not ridicule, not confusion, admiration. It started with whispers. Carter muttering, "Wait, that makes sense," then another student nodding along. Zion wasn't just solving anymore. He was breaking through fear and doubt, wordlessly reminding every kid in that room that truth doesn't shout, it proves. Ms. Linden's expression was unraveling. She stood frozen at her desk, gripping her planner like it was a lifeline. That's not the correct way to structure that equation, she said sharply, her voice trying to regain command. But her tone cracked. Zion didn't turn. He didn't need to. It's not about how it's structured, he said, still writing. It's about whether it holds up. The simplicity of his voice pierced through the tension, and even students who'd been unsure now watched with new eyes. Zion wasn't showing off. He was correcting an injustice in real time, and Ms. Linden knew it. She tried again. This is wasting instructional time. But her voice had lost its bite. Mira, without raising her hand, spoke clearly from her seat. It's not wasting time, if we're finally learning something that's not fake. A few students laughed nervously. Others looked stunned. Mira wasn't known for speaking up. Her voice was the unspoken permission the cast needed. Zion turned slightly, and gave her the smallest nod. Nod of thanks. Of alliance. They were both done pretending. As he neared the midpoint of the rewritten puzzle, Zion drew a comparison to the earlier version, still faintly visible beneath the chalkboard. This is where it goes wrong, he said, circling a previous loop Ms. Linden had created. This part reroutes the logic into a dead end. He paused. You wouldn't notice it at first. It's too clean, too symmetrical, but it's fake. That's the trick. His voice wasn't accusatory, but it struck harder than anything angry could. He was explaining sabotage with clinical clarity, stripping away the veneer of academic rigor Linden had hidden behind for years. Her response was desperate now. There's more than one method to solve higher-level problems, she said, stepping closer, trying to edge back into authority. Just because you found one way doesn't mean others are invalid. Zion turned, finally meeting her eyes. Then why did every version you gave end with a loop? The class inhaled sharply. Ms. Linden opened her mouth, but there was nothing left to say. The control she built around precision, posture, and fear was gone, and all that remained was her fragility, exposed by the very logic she claimed to defend. Zion finished reconstructing the equation. One final line connected. The puzzle was whole. Solvable. Balanced. The kind of challenge that actually tested intellect, not obedience. For a moment, no one moved. Then a slow clap echoed in the back of the room. It was Carter. Then Mira. Then the rest followed. Not in mockery, but respect. Even the students who weren't sure how to feel before now joined in. Not loud, not dramatic, just undeniable. The classroom had shifted, not just in energy, but in ownership. But then the door creaked open, and the principal walked in. Mrs. Edmondson's heels clicked against the linoleum floor with practiced rhythm. She wasn't smiling. Her eyes scanned the room with the speed of someone used to stepping into chaos. "What's going on here?" she asked, gaze settling on the board. Then Zion, then Miss Linden, who immediately spoke. "This student," she said stiffly, "is disrupting my class with unauthorized demonstrations." Her voice was a brittle mix of false calm and naked panic. Zion said nothing. He didn't need to. Mira raised her hand. "That's not true," she said. "He solved the puzzle, the real version. He proved she changed it so no one could win." The principal's brow furrowed. She turned to Zion. "Is that correct?" Zion finally spoke, voice calm, steady. "The original problem was unsolvable. I found multiple alterations that contradict the stated solution path. I rebuilt it from scratch using correct logic. And it worked." Mrs. Edmondson looked at the board, the chalk still clutched in Zion's hand. She stepped forward and examined the equations. Her silence was long, calculated. She had a background in science before becoming principal. She knew what she was looking at. She traced a few lines with her finger, scanning the pattern. "This is functional." Her voice was flat but layered with something else. Recognition. "Where did you learn this method?" Zion answered. "I taught myself. I read mathematical logic to understand systems, especially ones that don't want to be solved." It was a quiet dagger. Ms. Linden jumped in. "Principal Edmondson, I believe we need to redirect this class and conduct a formal review. I feel deeply disrespected by..." But she didn't finish, because Zion's phone buzzed again, loud enough to interrupt. Mira's too, then Carter's, then nearly everyone's. Another alert. Zion looked at the screen. It was the same video, but now posted by a verified account. Caption: Black student exposes racist sabotage in math class. Watch the moment he flips the room. The views were crossing 120,000. Comments pouring in. It was spreading fast. Viral fast. Zion turned his screen around and showed the principal. She stared at it, the glow from the phone reflecting off her glasses. "You didn't post this?" she asked. Zion shook his head. "No, but someone who saw the truth did." Behind them, Ms. Linden looked like she had stopped breathing. Her eyes were wide, frozen in horror. Then, unexpectedly, Grayson stood up. "I posted it," he said, quiet, but not ashamed. "I saw what she was doing last year. To Micah, to Terrence, and now to Zion. I wasn't brave enough then. I'm not making the same mistake now." The class erupted in low murmurs again. The narrative had flipped, and Miss Linden wasn't just exposed. She was cornered. Principal Edmondson exhaled slowly. "All right. Everyone take 5 minutes to breathe. Ms. Linden, I'd like a word with you outside." Ms. Linden didn't move. Now Edmondson repeated. She walked out first. Linden followed, her legs stiff. As the door closed behind them, the room burst, not into chaos but into cathartic release. Students began whispering, exhaling. Mira leaned toward Zion. "You just burned the whole building down," she said, eyes wide. Zion didn't smile. "I just showed them the fire was already there." But just as the class started catching its breath, Zion's phone buzzed once more. He glanced at the screen, a new message from an unknown number. Just one sentence. "You think this ends with her?" Zion looked up, eyes narrowing, as a shadow passed the hallway window. And standing there, watching through the glass, was a man in a school board badge, with a look that wasn't surprised but disappointed. Like he'd seen this before, and didn't plan to let it go public again. Zion stood at the center of the room, the chalkboard behind him glowing with the final flawless equation. A masterpiece built from integrity, logic, and resistance. The board no longer looked like a battlefield. It was a monument now. A clean, elegant solution that unraveled a trap and rebuilt it with precision. He turned toward the class, expecting nothing, yet knowing everything had changed. His classmates weren't just watching, they were seeing him. Some with awe, others with guilt, many with overdue respect. For a brief second, Zion let himself breathe. Just one breath. But the applause never came from the person who mattered most in that moment. Ms. Linden stood stiffly near her desk, arms crossed, her face drained of its usual smug calculation. She hadn't spoken since returning from the hallway with Principal Edmondson. Her eyes didn't even flicker toward the board. Instead, they remained locked on Zion like he had committed a personal betrayal. The silence dragged until she finally spoke, and what came out wasn't concession. It was an accusation. "I don't know where you saw the solution," she said, her voice brittle with forced authority, "but copying an answer and pretending it's your own is still considered academic dishonesty." The words sliced through the air, with a venom so calculated it stunned the room. Carter's jaw dropped. Mira's eyebrows shot up. Zion didn't speak, not at first, because the sheer absurdity of the claim short-circuited his response. For a moment it didn't feel real. He blinked. "Excuse me?" he asked, softly but firmly. Ms. Linden took a step forward, regaining the composure of someone who knew how to perform righteousness under pressure. "You've clearly had access to an answer key, possibly from a former student or another teacher. There's no other explanation for how you produced this version, especially after failing the first attempt." Her voice grew louder, aimed at the class more than at him. She was shifting the focus, redirecting the energy, desperate, calculated, dangerous. "No," Mira said flatly, standing. "I have the whole thing recorded. He built it from scratch, right in front of us." She held up her phone. "From the first line to the last. You can literally see the changes." Other students nodded, murmurs growing. But Linden was already shaking her head. "You recorded a student, without permission," she snapped, turning the offense on. "Mira, that's a violation of school policy." "No." Zion cut in, voice controlled. "What's a violation is setting up a student to fail with a rigged assignment, and then accusing them when they don't." His hands were trembling slightly, but he didn't back down. He was past the point of retreating. He had faced humiliation before, but not like this. Not after proving himself. Not with truth on the board for everyone to see. "You're out of line," she hissed, stepping closer. "No, you're exposed," Mira replied, her voice growing stronger. "We all saw it." That was when the door opened again. An assistant principal, Mr. Blevins appeared and motioned silently to Zion. Zion Hart, can you step into the hallway, please? Zion's chest sank. He knew the routine. He was being removed, not the person who had manipulated the assignment, but the one who challenged it too loudly. Mira stood as if to protest, but Zion gave her a look. Stay calm. Not yet. She sat, reluctantly. Zion gathered his things, the whispers behind him a mix of support and disbelief. Carter muttered, "This is messed up." Another student whispered, "She's trying to bury him." He didn't look back. The hallway was cold. Too cold. Zion stood with his back straight, arms at his side, as Mr. Blevins walked him toward the front office. "We're just going to have a quick discussion," he said, but his tone was rehearsed, flat, like he didn't believe the words himself. The office door clicked shut behind them. Inside, a counselor sat waiting, along with the school resource officer, not in uniform, but still wearing the badge. Zion's breath caught for half a second. Mr. Blevins cleared his throat. "There's been a concern raised about academic integrity," he said. "Specifically, the legitimacy of your solution to today's classroom assignment." Zion said nothing. They weren't asking questions. They were circling him, preparing the narrative. "Ms. Linden believes you may have accessed the answer prior to class," the counselor added, her smile thin and transactional. She stated she has never seen a student replicate the puzzle's logic that way. She believes it was likely copied. Zion finally looked up. "You mean she never saw someone beat her rigged system? So now I must have cheated." The resource officer leaned forward slightly. "No one's saying that. We're just trying to get the full picture." Zion wanted to laugh. The full picture had been on the board in plain sight. He reached into his backpack and pulled out the crumpled note from Terrence Jameson, the one he had carefully preserved all morning. He placed it on the desk in front of them. This was hidden in her classroom. "Read the bottom." The counselor picked it up, squinting at the handwriting, as her lips moved silently through the line. "Next one better know his place." The tension in the room shifted. "We'll look into this," she said, more cautious now. "But for now we're going to keep you in the guidance room, until your guardian arrives." And then, as if summoned by sheer gravity, the front office door flew open. Vanessa Hart, Zion's mother, walked in without being escorted. Her strides were sharp, controlled, and urgent. She wasn't yelling. That wasn't her style. But her presence exploded into the room like a siren. "Is there a reason my son was pulled from class after being racially targeted on video?" Her voice was smooth, laced with fury she didn't need to shout. Mr. Blevins froze. "Miss Hart." She didn't let him finish. She pulled out her phone and tapped the screen. "The video's been viewed over 600,000 times in 2 hours, including by a civil rights attorney I spoke with 15 minutes ago." She turned the screen toward the room. "Tell me again why my son is being isolated while the teacher who manipulated an entire lesson plan is still leading a class." No one responded. The silence in that office was louder than any fight. Zion sat still, watching his mother not just defend him, but level the entire room with facts, video, and controlled rage. "You pulled him because you didn't expect him to win," she said. "You planned to clean this up quietly, before it went public. That's not going to happen now." The counselor stood, flustered. "We understand your frustration." Vanessa cut her off. "You have no idea what frustration is. You have no idea how many nights I spent reminding my son not to explode, when teachers doubted him. You have no idea what it costs to raise a black boy, who's smarter than the system is comfortable with. And now, you want to label him a cheater?" Mr. Blevins cleared his throat again. "We'll need to launch a formal investigation." "You better," Vanessa replied, "because I'll be launching one of my own, with lawyers." As she turned toward Zion, her voice softened. "You good?" He nodded slowly, eyes wide with gratitude and disbelief. She touched his shoulder. "You handled it. I'm just here to finish what you started." But just then, the school phone rang on the desk. The secretary picked it up, nodded once, and looked at Mr. Blevins. "The superintendent's assistant is on line 3. She says the board meeting's being moved up, and she wants the full incident report. Now." Vanessa looked down at her phone again. Another message notification. She opened it slowly. It was from an unknown number. "You're making noise. Be careful what you dig up next." The door to the principal's office slammed shut behind Vanessa Hart with a weight that seemed to shake the entire front hallway. Her boots echoed sharply against the tile floor as she crossed the room, her gaze locked on Principal Edmondson like a heat-seeking missile. Zion stood beside her, still silent, still holding on to the edges of calm that had gotten him through the morning. But something inside him shifted the moment he saw his mother's fire truly Henlick's. She wasn't just here as his advocate. She had come to dismantle everything. Principal Edmondson stood awkwardly near her desk, arms half raised like she couldn't decide whether to gesture to a chair or defend herself. "Miss Hart, I want to assure you that we are taking the situation seriously," she began, her voice smooth, trying to maintain authority. "Zion is not in trouble. We just needed time to what?" Vanessa cut in, her voice low but heavy, controlled but sharp. "To decide how to spin a teacher humiliating my son on video in front of the entire class." The principal hesitated. "There's protocol." Protocol didn't stop that teacher from calling him a cheater after he proved her wrong. Protocol didn't stop her from assigning a rigged puzzle to set him up. And protocol certainly didn't stop you from letting her stay in that classroom while my son got pulled out like he was the problem. Zion watched as his mother paced slowly, her phone already unlocked and the video queued up. She didn't need to explain. She just turned the screen and let it play. The room was quiet except for the sounds of Zion's voice as he broke down the rigged puzzle, Mira's steady camera work, the class's gasps, and finally, Ms. Linden's accusation. The rawness of it played like a confession. Unedited, unavoidable. Mrs. Edmondson's eyes flicked to the screen, then back to Vanessa, then to Zion. Her polished expression cracked slightly. "I was under the impression the footage hadn't been authorized." Vanessa's eyes narrowed. "It doesn't need your permission when it's evidence of public misconduct. That's not just a policy issue anymore. That's liability." The counselor seated in the corner of the room spoke up gently. "We understand you're upset." "I'm not upset," Vanessa snapped. "I'm enraged. My son was targeted. This school has a pattern, and now that the world is watching, you want to retreat into excuses." She turned back to Edmondson. "This doesn't end with apologies. I want a formal investigation. I want Linden suspended, effective immediately. And I want every other parent in that classroom notified of what happened." The principal stepped back slightly, defensive now. "Miss Hart, I understand your concern, but before we take any disciplinary actions, there are steps." Vanessa stepped forward. "Let me stop you right there. You didn't hesitate to pull him out of class without an investigation. But now you want due process for her?" Her voice trembled now, not from weakness, but fury. "My son did nothing wrong. He brought clarity to a setup. He exposed abuse, and your response was to isolate him." Zion, still silent, reached into his backpack and pulled out the note from Terrence. He slid it across the principal's desk. This was left behind by a student she failed last year. He transferred. She broke him. "You are not going to let her do that to me too." Principal Edmondson took the note with visibly shaking hands. The counselor leaned over, reading it with furrowed brows. "You're saying there's a pattern of this behavior?" Vanessa nodded. "Check the records. Look at the demographics of who leaves the gifted program early, who struggles after being in her class. It's not just a pattern. It's a statistic." The room filled with tension. The counselor glanced at Edmondson, who turned to her computer and began typing, likely pulling records, data points, anything to either deny or confirm what she was hearing. But it was too late. The school wasn't in control anymore. Vanessa stepped closer, holding up her phone again. "Do you know what's happening outside this building right now? This video has been reposted by 3 journalists, 2 education activists, and 1 state senator. It's already viral. And now, every hour you sit on your hands, instead of acting, makes you look complicit." The principal's voice was strained now. "We're not trying to bury this." "Then act like it," Vanessa snapped. "Because my next stop is the press. And I will not stop until she's out of that building, and my son gets the public apology he deserves." Zion looked over, and for the first time saw a flicker of something new in the principal's eyes. Not just fear, but panic. Panic that this wasn't going away, that it had already spilled beyond her control. She swallowed hard. "Linden will be placed on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending investigation," she finally said. "We'll send communication to parents by the end of the day, and we'll bring in a third-party equity officer to lead the review." Vanessa nodded slowly. "Good. That's the start." But her expression didn't soften. "We'll be watching every step." The counselor stood. "Zion, if you'd like, we can arrange for you to speak with a student advocate." "No," Vanessa said before Zion could answer. "He's not the one who needs counseling. What he needs is protection." Zion finally spoke. In a fair classroom, Mrs. Edmondson sat back in her chair, now visibly worn by the confrontation. I assume you'll be retaining legal counsel? Vanessa gave a tight smile. Already did. Just then, Zion's phone buzzed again. Mira had sent a screenshot. The video had crossed over 2 million views. It was now trending under Puzzlegate. A verified account had posted a clip with the caption, "When brilliance threatens bias, the system tries to erase it." But this time, the system got caught. The moment Vanessa saw the post, she exhaled sharply. It's out of your hands now. And she was right, because that night, as the school tried to contain the damage, an anonymous school board member leaked the full-length footage to a media outlet. The leak wasn't just the class video. It included screenshots of internal communications, early reports, and a list of previous underperforming students who had mysteriously dropped out of the gifted program over the past 3 years. Almost every name was black or brown. The story hit like a wrecking ball. News anchors debated the footage. Social media dissected every frame. And suddenly, Hawthorne Middle wasn't just a school. It was a symbol. Zion sat at home that evening in his room, watching the headlines scroll across his phone. He felt strange, not proud, not vindicated, just tired. The weight of being right shouldn't feel this heavy. And yet here he was, carrying it like a burden instead of a trophy. His mom knocked on his door before walking in, sitting beside him on the bed. "You okay?" she asked softly. "I should be," he said. "But I don't feel like I won anything." Vanessa nodded slowly. "Because this was never about winning. It was about being seen." Zion looked at her. "And now that I am, what do I do with it?" Vanessa placed her hand gently over his. "You keep going, because they expect you to stop here." But just then her phone vibrated. Another message. It wasn't from a friend, or a reporter. It was from a number neither of them recognized. The message was short. He wasn't the only teacher. Look deeper. Zion's eyes locked with his mother's, as the screen dimmed, and in that silence they both knew, this wasn't over. It was just the beginning. Zion barely slept that night. The blue light of his phone glowed across his face, as he lay in bed, scrolling through a tsunami of mentions, tags, and reposts. His name wasn't just trending. It was everywhere. Puzzlegate had gone from a single video to a nationwide flashpoint. Clips of him calmly dismantling Miss Linden's trap had been edited, captioned, and re-uploaded by educators, civil rights activists, celebrities, and ordinary parents with stories that mirrored his own. Everyone seemed to have something to say. Some called him a genius, others called him a symbol. But beneath the tidal wave of support were darker currents, threads accusing him of weaponizing race, comments mocking his mother's anger, posts claiming the video was edited or staged. Zion tried to stay focused on the facts. He had told the truth. He had solved the puzzle. But none of that shielded him from how fast the story had spun into something bigger than he could control. By sunrise, the video had hit 6.2 million views. Hashtags like "Jawing Black Boy Brilliance" and "academic gaslighting" surged alongside it. Zion sat at the kitchen table, cereal untouched, as his mom scrolled silently on her own phone. She had bags under her eyes, and the same fire in her chest, but now it was mixed with worry. "They're digging now," she said quietly. "The media, the trolls. They want something to discredit you." Zion didn't respond. He was reading a thread from a parent in another state, describing how their daughter had been broken down in a gifted program by a teacher who reminded her of Ms. Linden. Hundreds of replies poured in, stories of microaggressions, of sabotage disguised as rigor, of silence. Suddenly, the fight didn't feel local anymore. It felt like a pressure point on the entire system, but the attacks came just as quickly. News sites ran clickbait headlines. Did student really solve impossible puzzle? Or racial bias or viral overreaction? Some conservative pundits used Zion's name to rant about wokeness infecting schools. Zion's face, once anonymous, quiet, focused, was now a battlefield. And then came the YouTube reactors, the Instagram lives, the TikToks. His voice, his image, his smile, all dissected. Vanessa shut off her phone and stood up. "This is what happens when you embarrass power," she said. "They don't apologize. They retaliate." Her voice cracked for the first time. "We have to prepare for what comes next." Zion nodded slowly. "Let them come." I didn't lie. But part of him felt the cost. Being right meant being vulnerable. It meant every glance, every word, every mistake would now be analyzed under a microscope. By mid-afternoon, a panel segment aired on national television. 3 education experts discussed the footage live. One praised Zion's logic skills. Another questioned whether the teacher had truly intended harm. The third, a black principal from Atlanta, delivered the most viral quote of the day. When a black student outsmarts a broken system, we shouldn't ask if he cheated. We should ask why the system was built to doubt him in the first place. That clip exploded. It lit a fire across districts, PTA meetings, and even school board offices. But not everyone wanted change. Zion's email inbox started filling with anonymous messages. Some were coded, "Keep your head down, boy." Others were explicit threats. His mom called the district. They filed a police report. But Zion knew what was happening. The system wasn't just resisting exposure. It was preparing to defend itself. That evening, Mira called him, her voice shaking with energy. "You're on the homepage of Twitter, Zion." "Like actual homepage." She paused. "They're calling you the truth kid." He laughed once, dry, tired. "I didn't ask for that." Mira was quiet for a beat. "Yeah, but you earned it. They're scared of you now. That's why they're loud." But just as things were reaching a fever pitch, the unexpected twist came. Quietly, and then all at once. At 8:36 p.m., Ms. Linden broke her silence. Her social media accounts had been dormant since the story broke. But now a statement appeared on all platforms at the same time. It was clean, corporate, cold. A white background with black serif font. No emojis. No signature. Just a block of calculated distance. "I am deeply saddened by the recent mischaracterizations of my teaching methods. As an educator for over 10 years, I have always pushed my students to think critically and solve complex challenges. The winter puzzle was part of a multi-year tradition designed to engage curiosity, not to harm. I regret that a misunderstanding has caused pain to a student and his family. However, I reject any accusation that my actions were rooted in bias or discrimination. I have served diverse classrooms with integrity and remain committed to that standard." It was the kind of statement built for optics, not accountability, not truth. The backlash was instant. People saw through it. Responses flooded in. "You pushed him into a corner and called it tradition. Where's the apology? Integrity doesn't leave kids in tears." Even former students began to speak up. One wrote, "She made me redo my project in front of the class because she didn't believe I built it myself. I still remember the look on her face when I cried." Another simply posted, "She made me feel dumb for being different." The hashtag shifted from Puzzlegate to Linden lied. But then something else happened. Something Zion didn't expect. A former teacher at Hawthorne, now living out of state, posted a screenshot of an old staff email thread from 3 years ago. The thread discussed concerns about equitable grading, and in one message, Ms. Linden had written, "Sometimes kids think just being smart is enough. But in this world, it's about consistency, especially when they're already prone to attitude." She didn't name anyone, but the implication was clear, and the racial tone was unmistakable. That leak hit like a second wave. Vanessa paced the living room, phone in hand, as the news story updated in real time. Zion sat still on the couch, staring at the screen. The comments kept coming. The praise, the threats, the defenses, the breakdown. He didn't know which hurt more, being disbelieved, or being believed so widely that he became a symbol instead of a person. Mira texted again. "You okay?" He typed. "No, but I will be," she replied. "It's bigger than you now. But you started it." And she was right. Later that night, Zion looked out his bedroom window. The world outside felt quieter than the chaos online. But he knew that wasn't real. This thing wasn't ending. It was morphing. Every story like his, buried for years, was crawling to the surface now. The internet had turned his truth into a mirror, and millions were staring into it. But just as he set his phone down, another alert came through. Not from social media, from his school email. The subject line chilled him. "Board meeting materials. Confidential." The email wasn't supposed to come to him. It was a system glitch. Attached was a draft report, meant for internal review. Zion clicked it open and began reading. The report contained summaries of previous performance issues, flagged by Ms. Linden, but one paragraph was highlighted in red. It detailed how Zion had been monitored months earlier, after early concerns regarding authority response. It accused him of classroom posture issues, overconfidence, and disruptive nonverbal behavior. None of it had ever been shared with him, or his mother. Zion scrolled to the bottom and saw the worst part, a signature approving the red flag dated 3 months ago, signed not by Ms. Linden, but by Principal Edmondson herself. By morning, Hawthorne Middle School wasn't just trending, it was under siege. News vans lined the street like a slow-moving parade of judgment. Satellite dishes pointed skyward, reporters pacing the sidewalk with rehearsed questions and live microphones. Parents stood in clusters, some angry, some defensive, some quietly ashamed. Inside the building, administrators whispered behind closed doors while emails flew faster than anyone could read them. The school had become a symbol overnight, and symbols don't get the luxury of nuance. They get dissected. Zion watched it all from his bedroom doorway, as his mother stood on the phone with a lawyer, her voice low and controlled, the way it got when she was holding something heavy. The leaked board document sat open on Zion's laptop, the red flags glowing like wounds. He hadn't slept. He kept rereading the language, classroom posture issues, authority response, disruptive nonverbal behavior phrases, so vague they could mean anything. And that was the point. They weren't accusations meant to be proven. They were impressions meant to linger. He understood that now. This wasn't about one teacher. It was about a system that had quietly agreed to watch him more closely than everyone else. Long before he ever touched the chalk, the first former student came forward just after breakfast. A woman in her early 20s posted a video, eyes trembling but voice steady, describing how Miss Linden had questioned her placement in advanced math during sophomore year. She kept asking if I was sure I wanted to be there. The woman said, like it was too much for me, like I'd wandered into a room I wasn't meant to be in. The woman's name trended within minutes, her story shared thousands of times. Then another, and another, different years. Same tone, same quiet erosion. It became clear that Zion's puzzle wasn't an isolated incident. It was the most visible crack in a foundation that had been crumbling for years. Parents started digging. Old report cards surfaced, emails between teachers and counselors, notes scribbled in margins that suddenly made sense in hindsight. One father posted screenshots of a recommendation letter that subtly suggested his son might thrive better in a less intensive environment, despite straight A's. Another mother shared an email where Linden had written, "Sometimes we must guide students toward paths that align with their strengths." The son had dropped out of the gifted track 2 weeks later. Patterns emerged. The names were different. The outcome was the same. The district tried to respond with a statement about community dialogue, an ongoing review. But it landed hollow. The internet had already decided that silence equaled complicity. Hashtags evolved again. Hawthorne files, gifted or gaslit, who gets to belong? The story widened beyond one school, beyond one city. Educators across the country weighed in. Some defended rigor. Others admitted they'd seen similar behavior but hadn't known how to challenge it without risking their jobs. The comment sections were battlegrounds, but the center of gravity had shifted. People were listening to the students now. Zion's phone buzzed constantly. Interview requests stacked up. Local news first, then regional, then national. Producers used careful language, promising fairness, promising context. Vanessa screened every message, her jaw set. "They don't get to use you as a headline," she said. "If you speak, it'll be on your terms." Zion nodded, but his attention was elsewhere. He kept thinking about the signature at the bottom of that report. The principal's name, the date, 3 months ago, long before the puzzle, long before the video. The realization gnawed at him. He had been marked before he ever challenged anything out loud. At school, the atmosphere turned electric and brittle. Miss Linden didn't return to the classroom. Her substitute avoided eye contact, stuck to worksheets, and dismissed the class early. Students whispered in hallways, their conversations hushed but urgent. Some looked at Zion with admiration, others with resentment. A few with fear, as if proximity to him now carried consequences. He noticed it all, and pretended not to. He had learned early how to observe without reacting. During lunch, a group of parents confronted the administration. In the lobby, their voices echoed up the stairwell. Demands for transparency, for records, for accountability. A rumor spread that the school board was split, that some members wanted to contain the fallout, while others wanted to make an example. The leak the night before had cracked something open that couldn't be sealed again. Someone on the inside had decided the truth mattered more than loyalty. Zion wondered who it was, and what it had cost them. By afternoon, the superintendent announced an external audit. The phrasing was careful, bureaucratic, but the implication was seismic. The school wasn't investigating itself anymore. That alone felt like an admission. News tickers updated in real time. Parents refreshed feeds between meetings. Students scrolled in class, Teachers looking the other way because everyone understood that pretending nothing was happening would only make it worse. Zion sat in the counselor's office for a check-in. He hadn't requested. The counselor spoke softly about stress and coping, about the weight of attention. Zion listened politely, then asked one question that stopped her mid-sentence. Why was I flagged 3 months ago? The counselor's eyes flicked to the door. She chose her words carefully. Sometimes teachers raise concerns preemptively, she said. It's meant to support students. Zion nodded slowly. Support from what? He asked. She didn't answer. The silence told him everything. When he got home, Vanessa showed him a spreadsheet someone had anonymously sent her. Names, years, course tracks, exit dates. The columns told a story no one could argue with. Disproportionate removals, disproportionate recommendations, disproportionate doubt. Zion traced a finger down the list and stopped at a familiar name. Terrence Jameson. He exhaled, long and slow. They did this on purpose, he said. Not angry, just clear. Vanessa squeezed his shoulder. And now it's visible, she replied. That's what scares them. The backlash intensified. Defenders of the school accused families of opportunism. Anonymous accounts tried to smear former students, questioning their grades, their behavior, their motives. Zion watched a thread spiral into cruelty and felt the old ache in his chest. The one that came from knowing people would rather protect an institution than believe a child. He shut the app and went outside, letting the cold air ground him. He reminded himself of the chalk, the logic, the undeniable proof. Truth didn't need everyone. It just needed to survive. That evening, an envelope arrived without a return address. Inside was a handwritten letter from a retired teacher who had once worked at Hawthorne. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. I tried to raise concerns years ago. It read, I was told not to make waves. I regret my silence. Thank you for being braver than I was. Zion folded the letter and held it for a long moment. Bravery, he realized, wasn't loud. Sometimes it just showed up late. The offers kept coming. Panels, podcasts, features. Zion declined most of them. He wasn't ready to be a representative. He was still a kid who had wanted to go to math club and finish the semester without being turned into a case study. But then one message came through that made him pause. It wasn't from a journalist. It was from a producer with a single-line subject. Live segment, tonight. The body was brief, respectful, direct. We want you to tell your story in your own words. No edits, no commentary, just you. Vanessa read it twice, then looked at Zion. Live means no safety net, she said. Zion nodded. It also means no spin. He thought about the red flags, the signatures, the patterns. He thought about Terrence, Micah, the woman in the video, the retired teacher. He thought about the puzzle, and the moment the room had gone quiet, he felt the weight of being watched, but also the steadiness that had carried him this far. His phone buzzed again. The producer followed up with a time, a network, a promise. We won't cut you off. Zion set the phone down and met his mother's eyes. He didn't smile. He didn't hesitate either. The invitation was confirmed. Zion Hart would appear on national television that night, live with no script, and the countdown had already begun. The television studio lights felt artificial in a way Zion couldn't describe. Bright, too polished, and clinical, like they were engineered to spotlight without warmth. The set looked cozy on screen, but felt tense in person. A manufactured intimacy where real things were only allowed to sound like real things. He sat in a stiff chair across from the anchor, a woman with perfect posture and flawless makeup, whose voice sounded exactly the same as it did in the clips he'd seen online. Cheerful, neutral, practiced, she greeted him like a favorite nephew. He gave a polite nod back, but inside he was locked in, focused, ready. Vanessa stood off stage with her arms crossed, her eyes never leaving him. Mira had FaceTimed him from home before the show, reminding him of every reason not to flinch. Don't let them tidy you up, she said. Be exactly who you were that day. Just louder. Zion had smiled for the first time in days. Not because of the advice, but because someone his age saw him not as a headline, but as a person still figuring out what to do with sudden visibility. The countdown began. 3, 2, 1. The host opened with practiced warmth. Tonight we have a special guest joining us, Zion Hart, the 8th grade math student whose classroom video sparked a national conversation about education, equality, and resilience. Zion, welcome. Thanks for having me, he said. Clear but calm. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. She launched into the setup. Millions of people have watched you work through that math problem live in front of your peers. Many are calling you a genius. Some even say you're a role model. How does that feel? He didn't flinch. Honestly, it feels complicated. The anchor tilted her head. Complicated. How so? Zion looked straight into the camera. Because I didn't ask to go viral. I didn't solve that puzzle to prove anything. I solved it because I was put in a position where I had to protect my name, my future, my dignity. That puzzle wasn't designed to be solved. It was designed to break confidence. That's not teaching. That's control. The anchor smiled, trying to steer the narrative back toward comfort. But surely you recognize the inspiration people see in you. You've shown resilience in a difficult moment. Zion nodded, slowly. But why do we always have to be resilient after someone tries to break us? Why is the story never about why we were targeted in the first place? The smile on the host's face froze. There was a pause, small but visible. Zion didn't fill it. He let it breathe. Let it sting. The anchor adjusted her papers. You're very articulate for your age. Zion's eyes narrowed slightly. That's not a compliment. That's what people say when they're surprised someone like me can speak clearly. The studio grew tense. The control room's silence was loud in Zion's ear. But he kept going, never raising his voice. I don't want to be a moment. I want to be a message. What happened to me isn't rare. It's just recorded. There are students who get pushed out of advanced programs quietly, without cameras, without hashtags. I'm not the exception. I'm the evidence. The anchor tried again, softening. So what would you say to teachers watching this? To students who might be in your shoes? Zion inhaled. To students, don't shrink. Don't think silence will keep you safe. It won't. Speak, even if your voice shakes. And to teachers, if your students only thrive when they look like you, you're not teaching, you're gatekeeping. That line detonated across the internet, within minutes. The segment was supposed to be 6 minutes. It stretched to 11. Viewers flooded social media mid-broadcast. This kid just flipped the whole conversation. No rehearsed lines, just truth. He dismantled bias in real time. Donations began pouring into a crowdfunding page. Someone had started for his future education by midnight. It hit over $300,000. Professors from Yale, Princeton, and MIT tweeted support. One called him a prodigy of logic and emotional intelligence. Another wrote, Zion Hart should be teaching, not just learning. But the moment that sealed it was unscripted. As the show cut to a final question, the host leaned in. So where do you want to go from here? Zion. What's next? He didn't smile. I want to build something. A platform that tracks which schools push students out of gifted programs and makes them explain it. I don't want apologies. I want accountability. The host blinked. That sounds ambitious for a student. Zion didn't miss a beat. So, was solving a puzzle no one else could. The studio went quiet. The segment ended seconds later. But the story was just getting started. Within an hour, major networks replayed the clip. Twitter exploded with praise. TikTok users stitched together videos of Zion speaking next to their own stories of academic erasure. An educator in Detroit launched a thread about how black boys were over-punished and under-supported in honors classes. Parents across districts tagged their local school boards demanding change. Zion hadn't just spoken. He'd sparked movement. At home, Zion sat with his mother in silence. The TV muted as coverage of his interview replayed in the background. His shoulders were finally relaxing, but his eyes stayed alert. I didn't think I'd say all that, he admitted. Vanessa rubbed his back. You said what needed saying. He looked over at her. They tried to make me a feel-good story, she smiled. And you gave them a wake-up call instead. But just then her phone vibrated. An email. She opened it, paused, and passed it to him. The subject line was simple. Invitation to build with us. The message was short, but stunning. A major tech company, one of the top 3 in the world, was offering to meet with Zion. Not for a scholarship, not for a photo op, but to join a new initiative. They wanted him to consult on educational tools powered by AI and analytics, specifically focused on equity tracking. They'd seen his interview, they believed in his vision, and they wanted to pay him for his input immediately. Zion reread the email twice. He looked at his mom. Is this real? Vanessa smiled, tears forming. You made it real. Zion was about to respond when a second email popped in. This one from the district's legal office, with a subject that stopped his breath. Notice of disciplinary record reassessment. Internal confidential files attached. The email from the Elite Science Academy came wrapped in polished sincerity. Subject line: Honoring Excellence, Zion Hart Invitation. It was the same institution that had quietly denied Zion a merit scholarship just 6 months earlier, without explanation. Despite his perfect score, glowing teacher recommendations, excluding one, now obvious outlier, and a personal statement Vanessa had described as so strong it made her tear up 3 times. Back then their rejection letter was flat and impersonal, offering no reasoning, just a polite line about extremely competitive admissions. But now, things had changed. Zion wasn't just a name buried in a file. He was a headline, a walking, breathing challenge to every institution that claimed to be merit-based but couldn't stomach merit that looked like his. The email opened with pleasantries and buzzwords: brilliant demonstration of potential, celebrated example of resilience, commitment to STEM equity. Then came the offer: a full scholarship, immediate enrollment in their next accelerated program, and public recognition at their upcoming donor gala. Vanessa read it first and said nothing for a full minute. Then she placed the laptop on the kitchen counter, exhaled like someone had just offered her a suitcase of fake money, and muttered, "Now they remember his name." Zion read it silently. He didn't feel flattered. He didn't feel victorious. He felt watched, like the same people who once turned away from his brilliance now wanted to claim it as theirs. "They want a photo," he said quietly. "Not a student." Vanessa nodded. "They want to stand next to the light you made so they look better in the picture." The gala invitation made it clearer. A glossy PDF attachment included the event itinerary. Zion would be introduced between a defense contractor keynote and a venture capitalist's talk about disruptive learning. His name would be followed by the phrase, "Example of resilience in the face of adversity." No mention of the puzzle, no mention of racism, no mention of the system that tried to erase him. Just a sanitized story about a kid who overcame. Zion closed the file and leaned back in his chair. "They want the version of me that doesn't make them uncomfortable." Vanessa tilted her head. "Then, give them something better." Later that day, Zion wrote a response himself. No parent edits. No PR filters. Just truth. "Thank you for your offer. I respectfully decline. I'm not interested in being a symbol at your gala. I'm more interested in making sure the students who look like me aren't erased before they ever get invited. Instead, I'll be launching something I wish I had when I was 10. A mentorship network for Black students interested in STEM, one where no one has to perform pain to prove they belong." He clicked send. Within 2 hours, the Academy posted a carefully worded tweet about respecting Mr. Hart's priorities. But by then, his response had already gone viral. Educators from across the country reposted it with captions like, "This kid is redefining what leadership looks like," and declining the table they only offered when the cameras showed up. Iconic. Zion didn't feel iconic. He felt grounded, purposeful. By the end of the week, he and Mira had outlined the beginnings of what they called the Puzzle Project, a mentorship initiative rooted in one simple belief. The problem isn't that students of color lack brilliance, it's that the system keeps moving the goalposts once they start winning. They plan to match middle school students with high school mentors, offer workshops on logic, coding, and resilience, and create a database tracking how gifted programs across the country admitted or subtly excluded students of color. Fares for funding came in faster than expected. A tech executive donated $50,000 after watching Zion's live interview. A Black engineers collective offered free curriculum. A nonprofit offered legal guidance to protect students from quiet removal processes. Vanessa took a breath for the first time in days. "They tried to erase you," she said, "and now you're building something they can't ignore." But even in moments of forward motion, the past still knocked. On a gray Thursday afternoon, a handwritten envelope arrived at their door. No return address, just to Zion Hart written in all caps. Almost nervously, Vanessa hesitated before handing it to him. Zion opened it carefully, half expecting another vague threat or anonymous comment. But what he found instead made him sit down. It was a letter. "Zion, you don't know me, but I knew Ms. Linden a long time ago. I was in her class in I was the student before Terrence. The one who cried in front of the board trying to finish a logic sequence she said anyone with potential could solve. I couldn't. Because it was built wrong. She humiliated me. I left the gifted track that year and never went back. For a long time I thought it was just me, that I wasn't smart enough. Until I saw your video. You didn't just solve a puzzle. You solved a pattern. A cruel, hidden one. You made it undeniable. I've watched every clip, every word. I don't know how you stayed calm. I just wanted to say thank you. Not just for what you did, but for surviving what she tried to do to you. What she did to me, to Terrence, to others who will never speak up. You spoke for us too. You didn't just win. You made it matter. Jasmine R. Zion reread the letter 3 times. Then he placed it on the table, fingers trembling, eyes stinging not from pain, but from the weight of being believed by someone who'd lived the same invisible bruises. She remembers everything, he whispered. Every detail. Vanessa sat down beside him, rubbing his shoulder. There are probably more, she said. Stories that never made it to paper. Kids who still carry that shame like it was their failure. Zion looked at the letter again. Then we find them, he said. And make sure they know it wasn't. That night, Zion posted a photo of the letter carefully cropped to protect Jasmine's privacy. The caption was simple. It was never just about me. Puzzle project. The post exploded with responses. Former students began sharing anonymously. The puzzle project's inbox overflowed. Mira organized submissions into folders. Vanessa began drafting a proposal to turn it into a national database. The project had grown from mentorship into advocacy. It wasn't just helping students, it was protecting them. But just as the momentum built, another message arrived. This one digital. A direct message on social media, from a verified account Zion didn't recognize. It was brief. You've made a lot of noise. But not everyone wants those old files unsealed. Attached was a file name Hawthorne Evaluations 2009, and below it another line. Some of the names on that list are now principals, board members, even state officials. Be careful. Zion stared at the message, and then his eyes landed on the sender's username, a former district counselor who had mysteriously resigned 5 years ago, without explanation. The envelope from the former district counselor sat open on the kitchen table, its contents spread like evidence no one wanted to acknowledge. Zion stared at the file names, each one a quiet accusation. Evaluations, notes, transfers, recommendations that weren't recommendations at all. Vanessa read over his shoulder, her jaw tightening with every page. The pattern wasn't subtle, it was methodical. Students of color flagged for attitude, for confidence issues, for misalignment with program expectation. Each phrase functioned like a trapdoor, soft language that dropped kids into academic oblivion, while administrators kept their hands clean. Zion felt a familiar chill, the same one he'd felt standing at the chalkboard, when he realized the puzzle had been designed to fail. This wasn't a coincidence. It was architecture. The counselor's message followed up minutes later. Not a threat. A confession. She explained how she had been pressured to sign off on removals she didn't agree with. How dissent was labeled unprofessional. How speaking up meant being reassigned until she finally resigned for personal reasons. She wrote about Lyndon not as an anomaly, but as a beneficiary of a system that rewarded quiet compliance and punished disruption. I'm tired of carrying this alone, the counselor wrote. If you're willing to say it out loud, I'll stand behind you. Zion read the message twice, then closed his laptop. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt responsible. By the next morning, the decision had been made, not privately, not cautiously, publicly. The press conference was held in a community-center gymnasium that smelled faintly of floor polish and old banners. Folding chairs filled quickly. Cameras crowded the back. Reporters murmured into headsets. Parents stood along the walls, some clutching phones, others clutching memories. Zion stood at the podium with Vanessa just behind him, her presence steadying, protective. Mira sat in the front row, eyes locked on him, fingers interlaced so tightly her knuckles whitened. The microphone hummed. The room quiet. Zion didn't open with an accusation. He opened with context. He spoke about the puzzle, about how it felt to be challenged in a way that wasn't meant to be fair. He spoke about the quiet pressure of being watched, the invisible marks that follow you when adults decide who you are, before you prove it. Then he unfolded Jasmine R's letter. He didn't rush. He didn't dramatize. He read it exactly as it was written. Steady, respectful, unflinching. The words filled the room, landing heavier with every sentence. A few people wiped their eyes. Others stared at the floor, recognizing themselves in the spaces between lines. When he finished, he didn't stop. He read excerpts from 2 more letters. Anonymous submissions from former students who had found the puzzle project in the days since it launched. One described being asked to redo work in front of the class because the teacher couldn't believe it was original. Another described being advised to find a program better suited to your temperament. Each letter ended the same way. I thought it was my fault. Zion let that repetition do the work. He didn't need to explain it. A reporter raised her hand. Zion, why do this publicly? Why not let the investigation play out? Zion looked at her, then at the room. Because silence is how patterns survive, he said. Investigations happen behind closed doors. So does denial. These stories don't belong in a file, they belong in the open. Vanessa stepped forward next, her voice firm but measured. She laid out timelines, dates, discrepancies. She named policies that were applied unevenly. She didn't shout. She didn't accuse individuals without evidence. She did something more dangerous. She connected dots. The board members seated off to the side shifted in their chairs. Cameras zoomed in. The atmosphere changed. This wasn't a family asking for sympathy. It was a case being built in real time. A former teacher took the microphone next, then a parent, then another former student. This one older, hands shaking as he spoke about dropping out of advanced classes and never returning. The stories overlapped in tone and outcome, like different verses of the same song. The room absorbed it all. The board representatives stopped taking notes and started listening. Some with faces carefully neutral, some with visible discomfort. The district spokesperson attempted to regain control. He spoke about due process, about the importance of fairness to all parties. His words sounded thin against the weight of lived experience. A journalist cut in. How many stories does it take before this stops being an allegation and starts being a failure of leadership? The spokesperson deflected. Zion watched the exchange with a calm he hadn't known he possessed. He understood now that truth didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be persistent. By the time the press conference ended, the narrative had shifted again. Headlines stopped asking if there was a problem, and started asking how deep it went. The Puzzle Project's website crashed under traffic. More letters arrived, some detailed, some short, all consistent. The board issued a brief statement promising transparency. It satisfied no one. That evening, Zion sat at his desk, rereading Jasmine's letter, then the counselor's confession, then the red flag report with the principal's signature. He felt the gravity of it pressing in. He wasn't exposing one teacher anymore. He was challenging a lineage of quiet decisions that had shaped lives. He wondered briefly whether this was too much to carry at his age. Then he remembered the kids who never got to ask that question because their futures had been quietly rerouted. The superintendent called the next morning. Her voice was careful, controlled, the sound of someone navigating a narrowing corridor. She announced a special hearing, independent, public, recorded. She named it what it was. A reckoning. We will hear testimony from all involved parties, she said, including Ms. Linden. The words landed like a bell tolling. Vanessa closed her eyes. Mira texted a single word. Finally. Zion hung up and stared at the wall for a long moment. Testimony meant questions. Cross-examination. It meant the past would be dragged into fluorescent rooms and dissected by people who had once benefited from its quietness. It meant Linden would have to answer not just for the puzzle, but for the years before it. The thought didn't make Zion feel victorious. It made him feel steady, prepared. Outside, news alerts chimed again. The superintendent's announcement had already broken. Commentators debated what accountability would look like. Parents demanded timelines. Former students posted screenshots of acceptance letters they never received. The narrative was no longer about Zion's brilliance. It was about a system being forced to explain itself. That night, Zion stood by his window, the city humming below. Vanessa joined him, resting a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to do everything, she said softly. Zion nodded. I know, but I can do this. He thought about the chalk, the loop that never closed. The moment he realized fairness wasn't accidental. He thought about the letters, and the courage it took to write them. He thought about the hearing, about sitting in a room where truth would finally be unavoidable. His phone buzzed once more. A short message from the former counselor. I'll be there. Under oath. Zion exhaled, slow and deliberate. The weight didn't lift, but it settled into something manageable. Purpose had a way of doing that. The superintendent's office released the agenda for the special hearing, and at the top of the witness list, in bold letters, was Ms. Linden's name, scheduled to testify last. The auditorium at Hawthorne Middle didn't look like a place where reckoning belonged. The folding chairs creaked under fluorescent lights, and the wooden paneling on the walls had faded from years of unnoticed meetings. But that night, every seat was filled. Teachers in pressed blazers, parents clutching printouts, students in silence, camera crews lined along the edges like a courtroom jury from another era. The hearing wasn't private, it was public, intentional, and the weight of the moment pressed on every breath in the room. The board sat at the long table up front, microphones angled toward them, like interrogators. Each nameplate sat stiff in front of a member, who suddenly wasn't just an administrator. They were witnesses, participants in a system that had quietly shaped futures with no questions asked. At the center sat the superintendent, shoulders squared, expression unreadable. The schedule had been published in advance, witnesses arranged from past to present, their stories threading through years of repetition. And at the end of the list, Zion Hart, last student to speak, first to make them listen. The hearing opened with formalities. A board member read the procedural statement like a shield. Then came the teachers, colleagues of Ms. Linden. They spoke with composed tones and practiced neutrality, rigorous curriculum, traditional methods, high expectations, but their language stumbled when pressed. A parent asked one directly, "Do you recall a single white student who ever cried in her class after being asked to prove their intelligence?" The teacher hesitated. Silence followed. The board scribbled notes, but the silence lingered longer than any answer. A former guidance counselor, the same one who had sent the files, took the stand next. She didn't cry. She didn't falter. "I was told to stop advocating," she said. "I was told some students needed redirection when they didn't conform. I saw black students removed for attitude, while white students with worse behavior were labeled passionate." She held up her resignation letter. "I left because I was tired of pretending it was normal." Her voice didn't rise. That made it land harder. The audience didn't clap. This wasn't that kind of event. But the shift was felt. Then came the students. Terrence Jameson's letter was read aloud by a moderator, since he had declined to appear in person. "I stopped raising my hand in class after Ms. Linden mocked me for giving the wrong answer in front of everyone. I wasn't wrong. I just didn't solve it the way she wanted. She told me I lacked discipline. I started skipping. By the time I was pulled out of the gifted program, I didn't even fight back." The words didn't shake, but the sound of a parent in the second row crying broke the room's silence anyway. Mira stepped up next. Her voice, usually fast and light, was slow and cutting. She showed the video again, the same one everyone had seen, but paused it this time. "Look at her expression," she said, pointing to Miss Linden's face in the frame. "That's not the look of someone witnessing brilliance. That's the look of someone realizing their trap didn't work." She flipped to screenshots of text between classmates. "She always calls him Zion, the confident one with that weird tone." I thought I was the only one who noticed. Mira didn't tell the board to believe her. She told them to look at what was already in front of them. Other parents shared stories. Small ones. Insidious ones. A changed recommendation. A missed email. A meeting canceled last minute. But collectively, they painted the picture Zion had already outlined with chalk. A system that wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it was built. And then it was Zion's turn. He didn't bring notes. He didn't bring a slideshow. He stood with his hands at his sides, letting his silence draw the room inward. When he spoke, it wasn't with fire, it was with finality. "I wasn't supposed to be here tonight," he began. "Not just in this hearing, in that classroom, in that gifted program. I was supposed to get discouraged. I was supposed to shrink. That's what the puzzle was for. Not to test me, but to break me quietly." He paused, looked at each board member. "But I solved it. And now we're here." He talked about the smudged lines on the chalkboard, the erased variables, the hidden version underneath. "That puzzle is a metaphor," he said. "It looks like a challenge, but it's a message. It says, you're not really welcome here unless you do it our way, at our speed, without making us uncomfortable." He didn't cry, but others did. In the second row, a teacher lowered her head. A parent squeezed their child's hand. A student bit their lip, blinking too fast. "I'm not here to make you feel bad," Zion continued. "I'm here to make you choose. Because when students walk into schools like Hawthorne, they bring brilliance. But we don't let all of them keep it. Some of them lose it trying to survive your expectations." He pointed to the board. "You can fix this. Or you can pretend this is just about one teacher and hope it goes away." Silence followed. But it wasn't empty. It was filled with the sound of reality settling in. And then, as the board prepared to recess for the final vote, the unexpected happened. Ms. Linden stood. She hadn't spoken all evening. She hadn't defended herself. She sat in the back, behind her union rep, wearing muted gray, face unreadable. But now she walked toward the mic slowly, hands trembling slightly. The superintendent tried to pause the session, but she waved it off. "No," she said quietly. "I have something to say." Everyone froze. She adjusted the mic, took a long breath. "I didn't expect to speak today," she began, voice small but audible. "I've been told not to, advised to wait for legal guidance. But I've watched this room fill with truth. I spent too long denying." The rep beside her shifted, clearly uncomfortable. She continued. "I did those things," she said, "not just to Zion, but to others. I wanted my classroom to reflect excellence. But my definition of excellence was poisoned. I taught it, reinforced it, and when someone brilliant didn't fit it, when they looked like him, I changed the rules. Subtly, quietly, but intentionally." A gasp rippled through the room. Zion didn't move. Neither did Vanessa. "I thought I was being rigorous," Ms. Linden continued, her voice cracking now. "But I was being cruel, and I was protected for it. Rewarded. No one stopped me. Not other teachers. Not administrators. I'm not saying that to excuse myself. I'm saying it because this isn't just my failure, it's yours too." The superintendent looked down, her lips tight. "I'm sorry," Linden said. "To Zion, to Terrence, to Jasmine, to every name I'll never know, because I never gave them the chance to stay." She stepped back, shaking. Her union rep looked like he might explode. But no one stopped her. The silence afterward was absolute. Then the board chair, clearly rattled, called for a vote. Just before they could cast the first ballot, a voice rang out from the back of the room. "I have an amendment to propose." Everyone turned. Standing there was the school board's youngest member, holding a folder that hadn't been part of the agenda, one that could change the vote entirely. The auditorium's air felt thick, like the moment right before rain breaks open on a dry summer day. After the youngest board member rose with that unexpected amendment, everyone sensed the rules were already shifting beneath their feet, but nothing prepared them for what came next. The amendment wasn't procedural. It wasn't even about discipline. It was a motion to open the floor for testimony, beyond what had already been presented. Invite additional witnesses if anyone felt unheard. That motion passed almost entirely on the momentum of raw truth flowing through the room. And then, after a brief pause to gather legal framing, the board chair asked the people's witness to take the mic again. Ms. Linden stood frozen, smaller somehow than she had been moments before. The confession she had offered earlier was already a rupture in her facade, but now it seemed like a prelude to something bigger, something no one expected. She was asked to speak again under oath. The room watched, silent and breathless, while the board member explained that her earlier remarks were heartfelt but incomplete. There were procedural obligations, they said, that required her to clarify them on record, so the investigation could evaluate intent with precision. Ms. Linden's face went pale. The sheen of her usual composure washed away like chalk dust under harsh water. She cleared her throat, gripping the podium with a stiffness that suggested she wasn't prepared for this level of exposure. I want to clarify something," she began, her voice wavering. There were no rehearsed euphemisms now, no polished defenses, just a teacher standing in the center of her own unraveling. "I never thought they'd notice." The words fell flat at first, almost a whisper, like a phrase spoken too quietly to carry. But then she repeated it, louder, because she saw the room leaning in, because the cameras were rolling, because the truth had found a way to demand its own spotlight. "I never thought they'd notice how I treated some students," she said, eyes flickering toward the rows of families whose children had been mentioned earlier in testimony. "I never thought anyone would look past the veneer of excellence. I believed if I pushed hard enough, they'd grow into it. I thought discomfort was part of growth. I thought excellence was the only language that mattered." Her voice cracked, not with melodrama, but with the raw, unfiltered exposure of someone who had worn self-deception like armor for years. She spoke of expectations, of traditions she'd inherited from her own mentors, of a curriculum built on competition and exclusion disguised as challenge. She spoke of a bias she had never named, until that moment, an unexamined belief that brilliance looked a certain way, sounded a certain way, fit into a certain mold. She said she had never thought students like Zion would outpace her assumptions so quickly. She said finally with a trembling voice that no PR team could have written, "I was wrong. I see that now." The room was dead silent, not the quiet before applause, but the kind that falls after something tectonic has shifted. You could hear the click of a camera shutter, the low hum of a microphone, the intake of breath from a parent who had lived the story long before it became public. Miss Linden didn't cry. She just stood there, unprotected by narrative, unshielded by excuses. When she had begun, the room expected defiance. What it got was something closer to remorse, or something that wore the name of remorse even if the sincerity could never be fully measured. Then came the board's ruling. Not a suggestion. Not a reprimand. A revocation. Her teaching license was rescinded effective immediately. The superintendent's voice was calm, objective, professional, detached from the emotional gravity that had just saturated the room. In light of all testimony and evidence presented, she read, "The board finds that actions and omissions by Ms. Linden constitute conduct unbecoming an educator and detrimental to student welfare. Her certification is hereby revoked." Zion didn't cheer. He didn't clap. He didn't even exhale fast enough for an audience to notice. He simply watched as a woman who once commanded a classroom full of authority was led out of a hearing in which she had just laid bare her own prejudice. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't vindication. It was reckoning. And reckoning isn't tidy. Vanessa stood beside him, eyes steady, not jubilant but resolute. "You did what truth does," she whispered. "You made them face themselves." Zion nodded out of instinct, more than emotion. There was no joy in watching someone fall, only clarity in the aftermath of accountability. Reporters mobbed the exit. Questions flew rapid, intrusive, hungry. "Ms. Linden, do you regret what you did? What would you say to students you hurt? Will you appeal?" But Ms. Linden kept her head down, eyes forward, barely speaking beyond an apology that trailed off into murmurs. Her union rep flanked her, his face strained, mouthing reassurances she didn't seem to hear. Zion and his mother stepped out of the building, into a corridor of flashing cameras and shouting reporters. The lights were intrusive, relentless, answers demanded at every turn. Vanessa was guarded and measured, deflecting whatever didn't serve the focus on institutional reform. Zion stood beside her, breathing without flinching yet aware of every camera's weight. This was the price of truth. Exposure. One reporter pushed forward, microphone angled toward Zion's face. "Zion, do you feel justice was served?" The question hung between them like a taut wire. Zion looked toward the school once more, its brick facade bleeding into evening shadows, and then directly into the cameras. "Justice is a process," he said simply, "not a moment. What happened today was accountability, but the systems that created this aren't gone. They were just revealed." Another question, sharper, more pointed, came next. "Now that Ms. Linden's career is effectively over, do you feel any guilt for what happened?" A murmur ran through the audience. People leaned in. That was the moment of truth, not for Ms. Linden, but for Zion. "I don't celebrate her loss of career," he answered, calm but clear. "I'm not here to ruin someone's life. I'm here to rebuild the spaces that let situations like this happen. If accountability feels like loss, maybe that's because we're finally naming what we tolerated for so long." The microphone was still inches from his face, but he didn't flinch. He spoke with the gravity of someone who had watched systems fail, who had learned early that truth meant vulnerability. And in that vulnerability, power, not of revenge, but of authenticity. Cameras clicked. Recorders hummed. The moment was being archived in real time. Anchors across networks would replay his words later that night. Some would frame it as wisdom beyond his years. Others would interpret it as a threat to the status quo. But Zion didn't think in headlines. He thought in the futures of kids who might walk into classrooms with their brilliance intact, not targeted or rerouted. Vanessa placed a hand lightly on his back. "You handled that with more strength than most adults," she whispered, pride lacing her tone. Zion didn't respond with words. The weight of the moment swallowed conversation. This wasn't over. This was an inflection point. Reporters weren't done. One shouted a question that sliced through the night air like an unexpected curveball. "Zion, do you think Ms. Linden's bias was personal or systemic? Do you think others like her are still teaching right now?" His eyes sharpened, not with anger, but with the precision of someone who understood nuance and consequence. Before he could answer, another voice, urgent, familiar, insistent, cracked through the crowd. "Zion Hart." A reporter from a national network pushed forward, microphone extended. "Will you take up the national offer from that tech company? Will you leave Hawthorne to work on education reform?" Silence fell. Not because the question was unexpected, but because everyone realized Zion was about to answer in a way no one had asked him before. And then before the words could form on his lips, a different reporter, one from a local newspaper, asked something that stopped him in his tracks in a way no one else had so far. "Zion," she said, her tone gentle but probing, "you've spoken about systems and bias, But do you think you would have uncovered all of this if you hadn't been black? The words didn't hang. They landed sharp, precise, unavoidable. Zion froze. Not because the question was unfair, but because it was the first time someone had asked him to articulate the core of his experience. Not as a student, not as a symbol, but as a black boy, navigating spaces that rarely saw him as whole. The lights blinked, cameras focused, reporters scribbled. And in that exact moment, before he could speak, before anyone could process what truth he was about to share, a producer from the national network lunged forward with her own urgent question. Zion, if you could tell every school in America one thing about what just happened, what would it be? Zion's gaze didn't flicker. He looked directly into the maze of cameras and lights and waiting voices. And then he spoke. It's not about fixing teachers, he said softly. It's about fixing what students are forced to fix inside themselves. Before his phone buzzed with a notification that made him stop mid-sentence, an alert marked urgent from an anonymous source, containing a single encrypted file labeled Hawthorne Hidden Transcripts. The question came as reporters surrounded him outside the courthouse steps, microphones shoving their demands like unintended intrusions into a life that had already been pushed into the public eye long before he was ready. Do you feel like you want? Zion turned slowly and looked at the red brick of Hawthorne Middle School behind him. The same building whose windows reflected not just a school but a summer of reckoning, testimony, viral hashtags and bruised confidence made visible. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He didn't pull back triumphantly. Instead, his voice, steady, measured, thoughtful, answered a truth far beyond the question's narrow intent. Not yet. It wasn't about victory, he knew, because he understood now that there wasn't a single finish line to cross, just a series of doors that needed permanent propping open for others. He didn't want revenge, not against teachers who had guarded their version of excellence behind intimidation, not against administrators who had labeled his confidence as a problem, not against the system that had assumed he would fold. What he wanted was change. Change that didn't come in waves of sensational headlines or momentary social media applause, but in the daily logic of classrooms across the country where young black students wouldn't be harassed, dismissed, or redirected simply because their brilliance didn't fit the narrow shape some adults expected it to. In the weeks that followed that answer, the glow of the cameras and the constriction of the microphones faded for many. But not for Zion. Instead of slipping back into the anonymity he once took for granted, he worked. He worked with educators, with civil rights lawyers, with data analysts, and most importantly, with students who wrote to him from places he had never heard of before. Letters filled with stories of whispered discouragements, elective course discouragements, subtle redirections, and concealed biases that now finally had somewhere to land. Vanessa watched him at the kitchen table late into nights, not frantic the way he had been during the hearing, but thoughtful and purposeful, pacing through spreadsheets and drafting what would become the national initiative to fight classroom bias, a framework designed to track inequities in gifted and advanced placement programs, to offer legal support for students unfairly removed or sidelined, and to train educators in recognizing subtle or overt forms of bias in evaluation and instruction. The initiative was built, not on vengeance but on evidence and empathy, and it gathered supporters from every corner of the educational landscape, former professors with tenure, researchers with statistics that validated students' lived experiences, and black alumni from elite institutions who spoke directly to the mismatch between potential and opportunity they had lived through. Sponsors lined up not because Zion was a trending story, but because his clarity had reframed a problem they had suspected but never seen articulated so painfully and precisely. Vanessa didn't try to contain her pride. She simply watched, eyes misting, as her son, the boy who once walked into a classroom, simply wanting to solve a puzzle, now walked across lecture halls, where scholars spoke his name, not as a novelty, but as a touchstone for reform. Mira became his closest ally and strategic coordinator. Together they worked on the puzzle project's expansion, ensuring it wasn't just a mentorship program, but a platform giving voice to marginalized students nationwide. Task forces were formed, research teams assembled, and community forums scheduled from Boston to Los Angeles. But through all of this, Zion remained unmistakably grounded. He remembered the feeling of erasure, of being watched, of expectation and assumption, and it fueled a resolve that was gentle but relentless. He spoke at school districts, to PTOs, to university panels. He listened more than he lectured, learning the myriad ways bias lived in systems that prided themselves on fairness, but practiced exclusion. Every phone buzz, every email, every new name brought with it a story that reaffirmed one thing: There were more puzzles to solve than the one chalked onto that board back in December. The puzzles had names: Jasmine, Terrence, Micah, and their echoes filled in boxes with reminders that systemic change was not a project completed in a hearing room, but a marathon of attention and care. The initiative's launch went live with a digital symposium streamed globally. The banner read "Expanding Minds, Expanding Opportunities." Thousands tuned in, including students logging in from rural towns, urban districts, charter schools, and suburban campuses alike. Speakers shared data visualizations, showing disproportionate disciplinary actions against students of color. Testimonials from families who had quietly moved districts to escape discriminatory tracking, and instructional videos helping parents decode obscure school policies that hid biased practices behind bureaucratic language. Zion stepped onto that virtual stage with the same calm that had characterized his testimony in the hearing, but now there was a new depth to his voice, a resonance born not of spotlight, but of purpose. "This is not about being against teachers," he said. "It's about being against barriers. If we fix classrooms for all students, the education system becomes better for everyone." The chat exploded with support, but also with raw stories, some heartbreaking, some hopeful, all carrying the weight of truth that too many had carried alone for too long. Alongside support came scrutiny, not of Zion's character, but of the initiative's implications. School boards questioned funding, districts negotiated policy changes, unions debated the language of bias training, and education policy analysts dug into the data, some with applause, others with caution. The scrutiny was not hostile, but evaluative, and Zion's team welcomed it. Rigorous debate was part of meaningful change, but he still felt it all, the emotional friction of dismantling assumptions ingrained for generations. Some nights Vanessa found him staring at his phone, reading one more email from a student too young to articulate their pain but old enough to have felt it deeply. Through it all, Zion's public presence remained thoughtful, yet powerful. Professors invited him to lecture. Civil liberties organizations asked him to join advisory councils. Tech companies reached out with funding offers and developer collaborations to build educational equity tools. One offer, from a major platform that monitored educational data at scale, promised to build interactive analytics for tracking bias geographically and demographically across states. It was a collaboration that could turn stories into measurable policy change. But Zion and his advisors were cautious. Not every offer that came with resources came with aligned purpose. They interviewed tech leads, asked about data privacy and intention, demanded commitments to transparency and community oversight. The process was painstaking but necessary. They knew the moment required integrity, not expedient. Vanessa watched him negotiate with both fire and diplomacy. "I'm not just selling a movement," he told her one late evening. "I'm protecting it." And she nodded, understanding the weight of a voice that had become a reference point in conversations about fairness, equity, and history's unspoken demands. Then, just as the initiative's first quarterly impact report was about to publish, a document showing statistically significant decreases in biased removals and increases in mentorship engagement, a new alert came through Zion's email. It was flagged urgent and came from the same anonymous source whose earlier message had unlocked hidden files. His heart didn't skip. It braced. He opened the attachment with a lock of ritual familiarity, and there it was, a folder labeled Hawthorne Internal Reports. The folder sat on his screen like an uninvited echo. His breath caught. This was different from earlier files. Earlier files had exposed bias within the classroom. These were institutional evaluations, teacher feedback loops, district-wide disciplinary matrices, emails between principals discussing performance metrics, not just for Ms. Linden, but for other educators trained under the same rigor-first philosophy. He scanned the first document and his eyes widened. It was a performance review of a teacher in a district 2 states away. The language was eerily familiar. Phrases about corrective pacing, asserting authority, student demeanor issues, and the same vague markers that had been used against him. Beneath it, another file, an internal memo titled Standardizing Challenging Classroom. It read like policy disguised as practice, a checklist of behaviors that masked bias as pedagogical effectiveness. Vanessa, sensing his tension, leaned in over his shoulder. "What did you find?" she asked softly. Zion didn't speak. His eyes stayed fixed on the screen. Because this wasn't just another data leak. This was a pattern, but larger, regional, possibly national. Something systemic that didn't just start with a rigged puzzle and a biased teacher. Something that had become encoded in school cultures everywhere. And then he noticed the file names at the bottom of the list. Evaluations for schools in Chicago, Atlanta, Seattle, New York, Phoenix, each associated with teachers who had never been publicly questioned, yet who used the same language to criticize students of color in performance reviews. Zion closed his eyes for a moment and exhaled slowly. "This isn't just one school," he whispered. "It's a philosophy." Vanessa placed her hand on his back again. "We knew it wasn't over," she murmured. But Zion didn't speak. His gaze lifted, firm and unwavering now, because on the very last file was a name he knew all too well, one of the district's most influential administrators, someone who had personally signed off on evaluations, promotions, and curriculum rubrics for years. And beside it, the years of influence stretched like a shadow over more schools than he could have imagined. When Zion opened that final file and read the signature at the bottom, his breath caught, not because of the name, but because it was followed by a notation none of the documents before had included: recommended for state education board appointment. If you've ever been underestimated, silenced, or told you don't belong, this story was for you. Because silence protects injustice. But truth shatters it. Type yes if you believe brilliance should never be buried by bias. Subscribe if this broke your heart.